Wyoming Territory, 1873. The wind was a lonely sound, a constant whisper across the vast, unforgiving plains that stretched out from the foothills of the Laramie Mountains. It was a sound Elias Thorne knew better than any human voice. It spoke of dust and distance, of winters that shattered hope like glass against stone, and summers that baked the very memory of moisture from the cracked earth. For 10 years, it had been his only constant companion, the soundtrack to a life he had deliberately pared down to the studs of survival. His ranch was a testament to this philosophy. A sturdy log house, a barn built to withstand a blizzard's fury, and miles of fencing that represented not a claim on the land, but a barrier against a world he no longer wished to be a part of. He stood on the porch of that house, a mug of coffee steaming in the cold morning air, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was a hesitant smear of orange and pink. He was 34, but the lines etched around his eyes and the set of his jaw belonged to a much older man. They were maps of loss, charting a territory of grief he never spoke of but navigated every waking moment. His world was one of routine and control. He mended what was broken, fed what was hungry, and slept only when exhaustion claimed him. Attachments were a liability, a weakness he had paid dearly to learn. Love, he believed, was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there and could never be again. His solitude was a fortress, each log in his house a stone in its wall, each fence post a sentry. Inside, the silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire or the quiet, efficient movements of Martha, the widow who came up from the small town of Redemption's Peak twice a week to manage his domestic affairs with a competence that bordered on telepathy. She knew not to ask questions, not to pry into the locked room upstairs or the stoic grief that clung to him like dust. She cleaned, she cooked, she left, and for that he was grateful. Her presence was a utility, not a connection. He took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter, just the way he liked it. The world was bitter. It was best to get accustomed to the taste. He watched the light crawl across the land, illuminating the golden grasses and the dark, solemn pines that marched up the slopes of the mountains behind his property. It was a beautiful, brutal country, and it demanded everything a man had. He had given it his sweat, his blood, and the shattered remains of his heart. In return, it gave him this, a profound and unbreachable isolation that he mistook for peace. Then, a sound cut through the wind's ancient song, an alien noise that did not belong. It was a long, mournful cry, metallic and sharp, carried on the crisp air from miles away. The train whistle. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of progress and people, of complications and entanglements he had fled. It came twice a week, a shrill reminder of a life he had abandoned, depositing its cargo of mail, supplies, and strangers into the dusty lap of Redemption's Peak before continuing its relentless journey west. Elias usually ignored it, turning his attention back to his chores, but today, for some reason he could not name, the sound snagged in his mind. It felt like a premonition, a faint tremor in the bedrock of his carefully constructed existence. He finished his coffee, the warmth doing little to touch the chill deep inside him, and set the mug down on the railing. The sound faded, swallowed by the vastness, but the disturbance it left behind remained, a ripple on the still surface of his soul. Later that day, Elias guided his wagon down the rutted track that led to town. The list in his pocket was short: salt, flour, cartridges. The journey was a necessity, not a pleasure. Redemption's Peak was a single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings that looked tired under the immense, indifferent sky. It was a place of pragmatists and survivors, people who understood the value of keeping to oneself. The saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office, they were points on a map of required interaction. He tied his horses to the hitching post in front of Miller's General Store, the leather of the reins familiar and comforting in his hands. As his boots hit the dust, the stagecoach, a lumbering beast of wood and leather, rattled to a halt in the center of the street, its arrival kicking up a cloud of golden phantoms. A few townspeople paused to watch, their curiosity a brief flicker in the slow afternoon. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of every trail west of the Mississippi, swung down and opened the door. First, a portly salesman in a rumpled suit emerged, blinking in the harsh light. Then, a hand appeared, delicate and gloved, followed by the woman to whom it belonged. Elias stopped, his hand still on the hitching post. She was a stark contrast to the muted, earth-toned palette of the town. Her dress was the color of a twilight sky, a deep blue that seemed to drink the sunlight, and though it was travel-worn, the quality of the fabric was unmistakable. A matching hat with a modest feather was pinned to hair the color of warm honey, coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She stepped down onto the dusty ground, her movements graceful but hesitant, her eyes scanning the small cluster of onlookers with an expression of hopeful expectation. She was a bird of paradise that had landed in a chicken coop, and Elias felt an immediate, instinctual tightening in his chest. She did not belong here. This place would chew up and spit out anything so fine. He watched as her hope visibly faltered. The person she was expecting was clearly not there. She clutched a small, beaded reticule, her knuckles white, her gaze sweeping the street again, this time with a dawning hint of panic. He saw her take a deep breath, her shoulders squaring with a resolve that he grudgingly admired. She approached the station master, a grizzled man named Jeb, and Elias could see the animated conversation, her articulate gestures, Jeb's slow, regretful shake of the head. She was alone, stranded, and in a town like this, a woman alone was a beacon for trouble. As if summoned by the thought, Silas Croft stepped out of the saloon. Croft was a man who was steadily buying up land and influence in the territory, a predator who smiled while he calculated a person's worth and weakness. He was large and florid, his expensive suit doing little to hide the coarseness of his nature. His eyes landed on the woman, and a greasy smile spread across his face. He moved toward her with the unhurried confidence of a wolf approaching a tethered lamb. Elias felt a surge of something hot and protective, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He told himself it was just a sense of decency, the instinct to shield the weak from the strong. Nothing more. But he did not move. He was not a part of this world. He did not interfere. He watched as Croft tipped his hat, his voice a low, oily rumble that Elias could not hear but could easily imagine. He saw the woman, Anna, as he would come to know her, stiffen. She responded with cool politeness, but her body language was a fortress under siege. She took a step back, and Croft took a step forward, closing the distance, his presence overwhelming. "Perhaps I can be of assistance, miss." Croft's voice carried now, slick with false charm. "A beautiful woman such as yourself should not be left unescorted." "Thank you, sir, but I am quite capable of managing," she replied, her voice clear and carrying a cadence that spoke of Eastern schools and refined drawing rooms. It was a voice that had no place here, as fragile and out of place as a porcelain teacup on a branding fire. Croft reached out as if to take her arm. "Nonsense. Allow me to buy you a drink. Help you get your bearings." That was when she stumbled. Whether it was a deliberate move to avoid his touch or an accidental misstep on the uneven ground, Elias never knew. Her ankle turned, and with a small cry of surprise, she fell backward. Elias moved without thinking. The years of solitude, the walls he had built, the vow of non-interference, they all dissolved in the space of a single heartbeat. 2 long strides closed the distance between them, and he caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back from the ground. She landed against his chest with a soft impact. For a moment, the world narrowed to the circle of his arms. He was acutely aware of everything. The faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the surprising sturdiness of her form beneath the layers of fabric, the warmth of her breath against his neck. Her head was tilted back, her wide, startled eyes the color of moss after a rain, looking up at him. They were intelligent eyes, and in their depths he saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, gratitude, and a profound, soul-deep weariness. The world rushed back in. Croft was staring, his expression a mask of thwarted annoyance. The townspeople were watching, their faces blank, but their minds surely whirring. He had interfered. He had crossed a line he had drawn for himself a decade ago. He gently set her back on her feet, his hands lingering at her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Are you all right, miss?" His voice was rough from disuse, a gravelly sound he barely recognized. "Yes, thank you," she breathed, smoothing the front of her dress, her composure returning with remarkable speed. She looked from him to Croft, a silent but clear dismissal of the larger man. Croft's eyes narrowed, shifting his assessment from the woman to Elias. He knew who Elias was. Everyone in the territory knew of the reclusive rancher with the haunted eyes and the skill with a rifle. "Thorne," Croft said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Playing the hero? Just helping a lady," Elias replied, his voice flat and void of emotion. He kept his body positioned slightly between her and Croft, a subconscious act of shielding. "The lady and I were just getting acquainted," Croft insisted. "It appeared to me the lady's acquaintance was complete," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. It was a simple statement, but the challenge in it was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills over the woman who stood, poised and silent, between them. The dust swirled around their boots. The sun beat down. Finally, with a small, contemptuous sneer, Croft tipped his hat again, a gesture of pure mockery. "As you wish." He turned and strode back toward the saloon, the swing of his broad shoulders promising that this was not over. The tension broke. The woman let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Elias Thorne, Anna Lowell," she introduced herself, extending a gloved hand. He hesitated for a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, her hand small but not frail within his calloused one. "You have my sincere gratitude. I am afraid I am at a disadvantage." "You were expecting someone?" he asked, releasing her hand. "My uncle, Mr. Jonathan Reed. The station master informed me he passed away 2 weeks ago. A fever." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her hands, the devastating blow of her predicament landing with its full weight. She had traveled 2,000 miles to find a ghost. Elias felt a pang of something dangerously close to sympathy. He knew about fevers. He knew about arriving too late. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. He should leave. He should get his supplies and go back to his ranch, back to his fortress of solitude. But he could not. He could not leave her standing in the middle of this dusty street, alone and vulnerable, with predators like Croft circling. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, would never have forgiven him. It was a thought that came unbidden, a painful whisper from a part of his heart he thought had long since turned to stone. "What will you do?" he asked, the question more practical than compassionate. I am not certain," she admitted, her gaze falling to the small inheritance her uncle had apparently left her, a deed to a small plot of land, now held at the sheriff's office. "I suppose I must find lodging. And then employment." Elias looked at her fine clothes, her articulate speech, her delicate hands. The only employment for a woman in Redemption's peak was at the saloon or as a laundress. She would not last a week. He thought of his own home, of the spare room that had once been a nursery, of Martha's sensible presence. The idea was madness. It was a violation of every rule he lived by. It was inviting the world, with all its complications and potential for pain, directly over his threshold. He heard himself speak before he had fully formed the thought. "There's a room at my ranch. It's clean, safe. Martha, my housekeeper, is there today. You could stay until the next stage passes through. Figure things out." Anna's moss-green eyes widened in surprise. She studied his face, her expression cautious, analytical. She was judging his character, his intentions, and he found himself standing straighter, hoping he would pass her inspection. He was offering shelter, a temporary reprieve. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. He was not offering kindness. He was not offering connection. He repeated this to himself like a mantra. "Mr. Thorne, that is an exceedingly generous offer, but I am a stranger. I could not possibly impose. It's not an imposition, he said, his tone clipped. It's 4 walls and a roof. Better than the boarding house next to the saloon. The stage leaves in 3 days. You can take it back east. He said the last part as much for himself as for her. She was a temporary problem, and this was a temporary solution. In 3 days, she would be gone, and his world would return to its silent, predictable rhythm. She considered his offer, her gaze thoughtful. She looked at the saloon, where Croft had disappeared. She looked at the dusty, uninviting street. She looked back at him, at his weathered face and the surprising steadiness in his eyes. He saw the moment she made her decision. A small, almost imperceptible nod. If you're certain I would not be a burden, I would be very grateful, Mr. Thorne Elias. He corrected her, surprised at his own impulse. My wagon's over here. He loaded her trunk, a surprisingly heavy thing of leather and brass, onto the back of his wagon and went into the store for his supplies. When he came out, she was waiting, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked as fragile and out of place as ever, and yet there was a core of steel in her that he was beginning to recognize. As they pulled out of town, leaving the dusty street behind, he did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the familiar trail, on the distant mountains that had always been his sanctuary. But he was aware of her beside him, of the space she occupied, a quiet, breathing disruption to the profound and absolute solitude he had mistaken for peace. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a simple, quiet knock on the gate. The ride to the ranch was mostly silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Elias was a man accustomed to silence, comfortable in it, but this was a different kind. It was an occupied silence, filled with the unspoken questions and assessments of the woman sitting beside him. He could feel her gaze on him from time to time, and he kept his own fixed firmly ahead. He pointed out landmarks with terse, one-word descriptions. Red Creek, Miller's Ridge, the North Pasture. There were not offerings of conversation, but simple statements of fact, a way to fill the space without truly opening it. Anna, for her part, absorbed the landscape with a quiet intensity. What to Elias was a familiar, almost monotonous vista of brown and gold, she seemed to see with fresh eyes. The sky is so vast, she said once, her voice soft with awe. In Boston, you only see it in small pieces, trapped between the buildings. It's big, all right, he grunted in reply, immediately annoyed with himself for the inadequacy of the response. He did not know how to talk about things like the sky. He knew how to predict the weather from it, how to read the clouds for rain or snow, but he had long forgotten how to simply see its beauty. When they arrived at the ranch, Martha was on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. She was a stout, sensible woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes that missed very little. She had been with him since before the silence had fallen over the house, a quiet, steady presence in the wreckage of his life. Elias, she said, her gaze flicking from him to Anna and back again. You've brought company, it was not a question. This is Miss Lowell, Elias said, climbing down from the wagon. She'll be staying for a few days, until the next stage. Her uncle, he's passed on. Martha's expression softened with genuine sympathy. She came down the steps and looked up at Anna. You poor dear. Come inside, get out of this dust. It's a terrible journey you've had. I'm sure Martha's immediate, uncomplicated kindness did what Elias's gruff practicality could not. It seemed to dissolve a layer of Anna's tightly held composure. Thank you, Anna said, her voice thick with emotion. You are very kind. Elias carried her trunk inside, the weight of it a solid, tangible reality in his house. He set it down in the spare room upstairs, a room he had not entered in years. It was clean, thanks to Martha, but sterile and unused. It had once been filled with brightly colored blankets and a small wooden rocking horse he had carved himself. Now it was just a room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the endless plains. He closed the door behind him with a sense of finality, as if shutting away the ghosts that her presence had stirred. That evening, the three of them sat at the large wooden dinner table in the main room. Martha had prepared a simple, but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light that made the familiar room feel different, smaller, more intimate. The silence at this table was usually his own, a comfortable solitude. Tonight, it was a chasm between three people. It was Anna who finally broke it. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice hesitant. "Elias." He corrected her again, more gently this time. "Elias," she repeated, testing the name. "I want to thank you again for your charity." "I do not know what I would have done. It's not charity," he said, focusing on his stew. "It's shelter. Place is big enough, nevertheless," she persisted. "It is a kindness, one I intend to repay. I am not accustomed to being idle. I can cook, I can mend, I can clean. I am also proficient in bookkeeping. If there is any work I can do to earn my keep for these few days, I would be grateful for the opportunity." Martha shot Elias a look over the rim of her water glass, an expression that clearly said, "See, she's a good one." Elias merely grunted. "Martha handles the house, and I handle the books. There's nothing needs doing." "I see," Anna said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She was proud. He had unintentionally insulted that pride. He felt a clumsy urge to fix it. "The work out here, it's not for a lady," he clarified, the words sounding condescending even to his own ears. Her chin lifted slightly. "Perhaps you would be surprised at what a lady can do when the situation requires it, sir. I may have been educated in the East, but I am not made of glass." There was a spark in her green eyes, a flash of the steel he had glimpsed earlier. He found himself respecting it, even as it made him uncomfortable. After the meal, Martha began to clear the dishes, refusing Anna's offers of help with a firm but gentle hand. "You're a guest, dear. You just sit by the fire and rest." Defeated, Anna moved to one of the simple wooden armchairs near the hearth. Elias remained at the table, cleaning one of his rifles, the familiar mechanical task of comfort. The scent of gun oil and wood smoke filled the room. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was not resting. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. She looked small and terribly alone, a solitary figure dwarfed by the ruggedness of the room, by the vast, dark wilderness that pressed in on all sides of the small house. In her stillness, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness, but hers was fresh and raw, while his was a chronic, scarred-over ache. "You said you came to find your uncle," Martha said, her voice gentle as she sat down with her mending basket. "Was he your only family?" Anna's gaze remained on the fire. "Yes. My parents passed away when I was very young. I was raised by a wonderful couple in Boston, the Lowells. They gave me their name, an education, everything. But they passed last year. My uncle Jonathan was my mother's brother, my last blood connection. I wanted to know him, to know something of where I came from." Elias stopped his work, the oiled rag still in his hand. He had assumed she was from a wealthy family, sent west for some frivolous reason. The reality of her story, a woman doubly orphaned, seeking a connection to a past she had never known, only to find that door closed as well, struck a chord deep within him. It was a story of loss. He knew about loss. "My mother was Apache," Anna said, the word spoken so softly it was almost lost to the crackle of the fire. "My father was a traitor. When she died, he felt he could not give me a proper life, so he sent me east. He always intended for me to know about my heritage, but he died before he could arrange it." The confession hung in the air. Elias now understood the subtle, high-boned structure of her face, the slight almond shape of her eyes, the resilience that seemed to radiate from her. It explained the extra layer of her vulnerability. A woman alone was one thing. A woman of mixed blood in this territory was something else entirely. It made Croft's predatory interests seem even more sinister. Martha simply nodded, her needle continuing its steady work. "Family is family, no matter the blood. It's the heart that matters." Anna finally looked away from the fire, a sad, grateful smile touching her lips. "The Lowells taught me that as well." She then turned her gaze to Elias. It was direct and searching, as if she were trying to read the closed book of his past. "And you, Mr. Thorne?" Do you have family in this territory? The question was an arrow aimed at the heart of his fortress. His jaw tightened. The rifle in his hands felt cold and heavy. No, he said, his voice flat. Not anymore. The finality in his tone was a slammed door, a clear signal that the conversation was over. But Anna did not look away. Her eyes held not just curiosity, but a profound, startling empathy, as if she recognized the shape of his grief because she carried her own. In her gaze, he felt, for the first time in a decade, seen. It was a terrifying and strangely liberating sensation. "I am sorry," she said softly. It was not a platitude. It was a statement of shared understanding, a bridge thrown across the chasm of their silence. He gave a curt, jerky nod and went back to cleaning his rifle, his movements stiff and mechanical. But something had shifted. The quiet of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared histories, the silent acknowledgement of the ghosts that haunted them both. He had offered her shelter, a roof over her head for 3 days. He had not expected that in doing so, he would be offering her a glimpse into the locked rooms of his own soul, or that she, in turn, would show him the key. The night wore on, the fire burned low, and for the first time in a very long time, Elias Thorne did not feel entirely alone. And it scared him more than any blizzard or wolf pack ever could. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended state of domesticity that was entirely foreign to Elias. Anna proved true to her word. She was not one to be idle. Despite his protests, she found ways to make herself useful. She had a quiet competence that defied his assumptions. He found her in the kitchen one morning, kneading dough alongside Martha, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a smudge of flour on her cheek. The sight was so unexpectedly right that it stopped him in his tracks. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her face, and he felt a jolt, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He tried to maintain his distance, spending most of his time outdoors, checking fence lines, tending to his small herd of cattle. The work was hard and familiar, a physical penance that usually cleared his mind. But now, his thoughts were filled with her. He would find himself wondering what she was doing back at the house, or replaying their brief conversations. Her voice, with its educated, Eastern cadence, was a constant echo in the silence of the plains. He was a man who prided himself on his awareness of his surroundings, but now his focus was divided. He was watching for threats on the horizon, but also listening for the sound of the front door opening. He began to see the strength she had spoken of. It was not the brute strength of a frontiersman, but a resilience of spirit that was just as formidable. She did not complain about the harshness of the land, the lack of amenities she must have been accustomed to. Instead, she asked questions. She wanted to know the names of the wildflowers that grew near the creek, the reason the fences were built a certain way, the habits of the hawks that circled high overhead. Her curiosity was genuine, a desire to understand this new world she had been thrust into. One afternoon, he was repairing a loose board on the porch when she came out, a cup of coffee in her hand. "I brought you this," she said, offering it to him. "Thank you," he mumbled, taking it from her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent another jolt through him. He took a sip. It was hot and strong, just as he liked it. She had remembered. She leaned against the porch railing, her gaze drifting out toward the mountains. "My uncle's land," she said, more to herself than to him. The sheriff said it's just a small parcel up by Willow Creek. He said it's not much, but it has water rights. He mentioned that a Mr. Croft has made an offer on it several times. Elias stopped hammering. Croft, the name was a foul taste in his mouth. That land is one of the only year-round springs in this valley. That's not land, that's lifeblood. Croft doesn't want the parcel. He wants to control the water. He's been trying to squeeze out the smaller ranchers for years, so my uncle's property is valuable, she mused. "More than you know," he said, his voice grim. "And Croft thinks because you're a woman, alone, from back east, you'll be an easy mark. He'll offer you pennies on the dollar. And if you refuse, he'll find other ways to be persuasive." She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "What kind of ways?" He met her gaze, seeing the dawning understanding in her eyes. Ways you don't want to find out about. The stagecoach leaves tomorrow. You should be on it. Take whatever Croft offers you and go back to Boston where it's safe. He said the words because he knew they were the right thing to say, the sensible thing. He was trying to protect her. But as he said them, a cold dread washed over him at the thought of the house returning to its empty silence. He was pushing her away, back toward the life she knew, because he was terrified of what her staying might mean. A flicker of disappointment crossed her face before it was replaced by that familiar, steely resolve. And what would I go back to? I have no one there. This land, this small piece of earth by a creek, is the only thing in the world that is mine. It was my mother's family's land. It's the only connection I have left. I'm not going to run away and sell it to a man like that. You don't understand what you are up against, he argued, his voice rising with an urgency that surprised him. Croft doesn't play by gentlemen's rules. Then perhaps it is time I learned a new set of rules, she countered, her voice quiet but firm. You told me I would be surprised at what a lady can do. I am telling you that now. He stared at her, caught between admiration for her courage and sheer terror for her safety. She was not made of glass. She was made of something far stronger, something that bent but did not break. And he realized, with a sinking feeling, that his fortress of solitude was not just breached. Its foundations were cracking. He wanted to protect her, but more than that, he wanted her to stay. The two desires were at war within him. The first sign of trouble came that evening. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Elias was in the barn, tending to the horses. His dog, a scruffy mutt named Blue, suddenly let out a low, guttural growl, the hair on his neck standing on end. Elias froze, his hand resting on the smooth stock of the rifle he always kept propped near the barn door. He peered out into the deepening twilight. At the edge of his property, where the trail met the open range, two riders sat on their horses, motionless silhouettes against the fading light. They were too far away to make out their faces, but he did not need to. They were watching the house. He stayed in the shadows of the barn, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was Croft's first move. A warning, an intimidation tactic. After a few long minutes, the riders turned their horses and melted back into the darkness. Elias let out a slow breath, his hand clenched around the rifle. It had begun. He walked back to the house, his stride purposeful. Anna and Martha were inside, the warm lamplight spilling from the windows a beacon of fragile peace in the vast, encroaching darkness. He did not tell them what he had seen. He did not want to frighten them. But the weight of the threat settled heavily on his shoulders. This was no longer just about a stranded woman. By bringing her here, he had painted a target on his own home. Croft was not just threatening her now, he was threatening him. Later that night, long after Martha had gone to her own small cottage nearby and Anna had retired to her room, Elias sat in the dark by the hearth, the embers of the fire glowing like malevolent eyes. He held a shotgun across his lap, his ears straining to catch any sound that was out of place. The wind whispered around the corners of the house, a lonely, mournful sound. But for the first time, he felt its loneliness not as a comfort, but as a vulnerability. The isolation he had cultivated for so long was no longer a shield. It was a liability. He was one man, against however many Croft decided to send. He thought of Anna, asleep upstairs. He had told her to leave, to run, but she had refused. Her courage was both magnificent and terrifying. It called to a part of him he thought was long dead, the part that knew how to fight for something for someone. He had built his life on the principle of letting go, of severing attachments to avoid the pain of loss. But Anna Lowell had walked into his life, and without trying, had forged a new connection, a slender, powerful thread that was now pulling him back into the world of risk and feeling. He was afraid, not of Croft's men, but of the hope she represented. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, and he knew better than anyone how easily it could be extinguished. He sat in the darkness, a sentinel guarding not just a house, but a flicker of light he was terrified to lose. The stagecoach was leaving tomorrow, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she would not be on it. and he did not know if he was relieved or horrified. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The stagecoach was due to pass through Redemption's Peak at noon. Elias found himself watching the clock on the mantelpiece, each tick a countdown to a decision. He had loaded his wagon, ostensibly for a trip into town for supplies he did not need. It was a pretense. He was offering her one last chance to escape. Anna came downstairs dressed, not in her fine blue traveling suit, but in a simple, practical dress borrowed from Martha. She carried her trunk with her, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought she had changed her mind. She set it down by the door. "My uncle's legal papers are in there," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And some personal effects. But my place is here now. I'm going to see the sheriff this morning and formally register my claim to the land. I will not be intimidated." He looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her green eyes, and the last of his arguments died in his throat. He could not force her to go. All he could do was stand with her. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Then I'm going with you." The trip to town was a stark contrast to their first journey. There was no silence now, only a shared, grim purpose. As they approached Redemption's Peak, they saw Croft and two of his hired men loitering on the porch of the saloon. They watched the wagon approach, their expressions smug and predatory. Elias felt Anna stiffen beside him, but she did not flinch. He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the sheriff's office and helped her down, his hand protectively on her arm. Sheriff Brody was an older man, his face weathered and his movements slow, but his eyes were sharp. He looked from Anna to Elias, then out the window at Croft's men. "Figured you'd be in," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Croft's been making noise all morning about the Reed property, saying a woman with no family has no business holding on to prime water rights. The land is mine by legal inheritance, Sheriff," Anna stated, her voice clear and firm. "I have the papers from my uncle's lawyer in Boston and the deed he left here. I am here to file my claim." Brody nodded slowly, stroking his gray mustache. He respected the letter of the law. "The claim is legitimate. I'll register it. But Anna, Miss Lowell, you need to understand what you're doing. Silas Croft is not a man who takes no for an answer." "This is going to get ugly, I understand," she said. "But I will not be chased off my own property." As Sheriff Brody processed the paperwork, Elias stood by the window, watching Croft's men. They were not trying to be subtle. They were a visible threat, a promise of violence to come. He felt a cold fury building inside him. This was his town, his territory. He had tried to retreat from it, but men like Croft were a cancer, and if left unchecked, they would consume everything. When the paperwork was signed and stamped, a small victory was won. But as they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the atmosphere on the street was heavier than before. Croft himself pushed off from the saloon porch and walked toward them, his boots stirring up the dust. "Miss Lowell," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity that made Elias's skin crawl. "I heard about your tragic loss. I want to renew my offer for your uncle's land. I'll give you a fair price, enough to see you comfortably back to Boston, where a lady like you belongs." "My place is here, Mr. Croft," Anna replied, her tone icy. "And the land is not for sale." Croft's facade cracked. A flicker of raw anger showed in his eyes. He took a step closer, his bulk intimidating. "That's a foolish decision. A woman alone out here. Things can happen. Accidents. It's a dangerous country." Elias moved, stepping directly between Anna and Croft. He was not as large as Croft, but he was leaner, harder, and his movements had the coiled readiness of a predator. "The lady has given you her answer," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's not alone." The declaration hung in the air, an irrefutable fact. He had drawn his line in the dust. Her fight was now his fight. Croft stared at him, his gaze filled with venom. "You're making a big mistake, Thorne. Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. That ranch of yours is a long way from town. A lot can happen in the dark. You come near my ranch," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "and you'll be the one who has an accident." The threat was unmistakable. Croft held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a short, ugly laugh. "We'll see," he said, turning on his heel and stalking back to the saloon, his men following like jackals. Sheriff Brody had come out onto the boardwalk, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "You just declared war, Elias." "He declared it when he threatened her," Elias replied, not taking his eyes off the saloon. He felt Anna's hand on his arm, her touch both a steadying comfort and a terrifying reminder of what was at stake. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a new kind of silence, the quiet before storm. The vast, beautiful landscape no longer seemed peaceful. It seemed full of shadows, each ravine and copse of trees a potential hiding place for an ambush. Elias's senses were on high alert, his hand never far from the rifle propped next to him. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a guardian. That night, he did not even pretend to sleep. After ensuring all the doors and windows were barred, he took up a position in the darkened front room, the shotgun across his lap. Anna refused to go to her room. She brought a blanket and sat in the armchair near the hearth, the fire banked low. "I should not have brought this to your door, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "This is my fight. You should not have to risk your life, your home. For me." He looked at her, a silhouette in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "You didn't bring it here. Men like Croft bring it everywhere. Sooner or later, you have to make a stand." I forgot how he paused, the confession costing him. For a long time, I didn't think there was anything left worth standing for. The implication was clear. She was something worth standing for. Her presence had reawakened a part of his soul he had tried to bury, the part that believed in justice, in protection, in connection. It was the part that had died with his family. "Tell me about them," she said softly, her perception once again cutting through his defenses. "The family you don't have anymore." He was silent for a long time, the memories of physical pain in his chest. He had never spoken of them to anyone, not even Martha. But in the charged darkness, with the threat of violence pressing in from the outside, the walls around his heart felt thin and brittle. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice thick with unshed grief. She was like the first day of spring, all warmth and light. We had a son, Sammy. He had his mother's smile." He stopped, swallowing hard. "We were just starting out. A small homestead, not far from here. The fever came through in the winter of '63. It took them both in less than a week. I was helpless. I just watched them fade away. After, I couldn't stand the sight of that place. I sold it and built this one. Further out, away from everyone." He finally shared the great, hollow secret of his life, and the world did not end. The house did not crumble. He looked at Anna and saw tears glistening on her cheeks, tears not of pity, but of profound empathy. She understood loss. She understood being left alone. "You blame yourself," she whispered. It was not a question. I was her husband, his father. I was supposed to protect them. He said, the guilt a raw, open wound. "I failed. A fever is not a man with a gun. Elias," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It is not something you can fight. It is something that happens. You survived. That is not a failure. It is a tragedy." Her words were a balm on a wound he had kept infected for a decade. She did not offer empty platitudes. She offered perspective. She offered absolution. She rose from her chair and came to him, kneeling on the floor beside his chair. She reached out and placed her hand over his, which was clenched white-knuckled on the stock of the shotgun. Her touch was warm, alive. "You did not fail them," she said again, her eyes locking with his. "And you are not failing me. You are the kindest, most honorable man I have ever met. You took in a stranger, you offered her shelter, and now you are offering her your protection. You are not the man you think you are, Elias Thorne." In that moment, in the quiet, fire-lit darkness, with danger lurking outside and a shared vulnerability laid bare between them, something fundamental shifted inside him. The grief was still there, a permanent scar on his soul, but it was no longer the only thing. Her faith in him, her strength, her quiet courage. They were planting something new in the barren soil of his heart. He looked down at her hand on his, and for the first time, he did not pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, a silent acceptance of the connection he had fought so hard to deny. They stayed like that for a long time, two solitary souls keeping watch in the dark, no longer entirely alone. The storm was coming, but for the first time, he felt he had something to truly fight for. The attack came on the third night, under the sliver of a new moon that offered little light. The world outside the windows was a vast, impenetrable black. Elias had known it was coming. The quiet was too profound, the air too still. It was the deep breath before the plunge. He had spent the day fortifying the ranch, boarding up the smaller windows, checking his ammunition, and walking Anna through the loading and firing of a rifle, a task she undertook with a grim, focused determination that impressed him. He was dozing lightly in his chair by the cold hearth, the shotgun still across his lap, when Blue's low growl from the porch shattered the silence. Elias was instantly awake, every nerve ending tingling. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. 3 figures were moving on foot, low and fast, from the direction of the creek. 2 more were circling around toward the barn. Croft had sent 5 men. He had underestimated the man's ruthlessness. Anna was already there, a shadow at his side. She held the rifle he had given her, its weight awkward but her grip firm. Her face was pale in the darkness, but her eyes were steady. There was no panic in them, only a cold, hard resolve. "They're trying to surround the house," he whispered, his mind racing, calculating angles and odds. "They'll try to set the barn on fire first, draw me out. What do we do?" she asked, her voice a low, controlled whisper. "You stay here, away from the windows. You only fire if one of them gets inside. Do you understand?" he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He grabbed his own rifle and a box of cartridges. "I'm going out the back. I can use the rocks by the creek for cover. I have a better chance of picking them off if I'm not a sitting target in here." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll be alone. They'll have you caught in a crossfire. It's the only way," he insisted, his hand on the back door. "Bar this behind me." Before he could move, a flicker of orange light blossomed from the direction of the barn. His gut clenched. They were faster than he had anticipated. The dry hay would go up like tinder. Soon, the entire yard would be illuminated, exposing his position. The first gunshot rang out, a sharp crack that was immediately followed by the splintering of wood as a bullet slammed into the front door. "Stay down," he yelled, pushing Anna toward the floor as another shot shattered a window pane, sending a spray of glass across the room. The fight was here. There was no more planning, only reacting. He moved to the broken window, keeping low, and raised his rifle. He saw a muzzle flash from behind the water trough and fired, the recoil a familiar, solid kick against his shoulder. A yelp of pain cut through the night. One down. The next few minutes were a chaotic symphony of violence. Gunshots echoed across the valley, the sharp reports punctuated by the angry roar of the growing fire in the barn. The light from the flames cast long, dancing shadows across the yard, turning the familiar space into a hellish landscape. Elias moved from window to window, a ghost in his own home, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He was a skilled marksman, and in the dark, on his own land, he was a deadly opponent. But there were too many of them. A bullet tore through the wall near his head, showering him with splinters. They were getting bolder, closing in. He heard them on the porch, the heavy thud of boots on wood. The front door shuddered as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. They were trying to break it down. He looked over at Anna. She was crouched behind the heavy oak table, the rifle she held looking enormous in her hands. Her face was set, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but she was not hysterical. She was holding her ground. A fierce, protective pride surged through him. "Anna!" he shouted over the din, the back door. "Get to the root cellar. It's the safest place." She shook her head, her eyes wide. "I am not leaving you." The front door groaned, the wood splintering around the lock. It would not hold for much longer. He knew then that he had to draw them away from her, give her a chance. He fired 2 quick shots through the door, rewarded by a curse of pain from the other side. Then he scrambled toward the back of the house. As he reached the kitchen, he saw a man's face appear in the window, a dark, leering shape against the firelight. The man raised his pistol. Elias did not have time to raise his own rifle. He braced for the impact, the flash, the pain. But it never came. Instead, there was a different sound, a solid, sickening thud. The man's face disappeared from the window. Elias spun around. Anna stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps. In her hands, she held a heavy cast-iron skillet, which she had swung like a club, shattering the window pane and connecting with the man's head. She had saved his life. The front door finally burst open with a crash, and two men spilled into the room, their guns up, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior. Before Elias could react, Anna did something extraordinary. She grabbed the oil lamp from the kitchen table, ripped the chimney off, and hurled the flaming, oil-soaked base at the intruders. It shattered at their feet, and a wall of fire erupted between them and the rest of the room. The men yelled, beating at the flames that licked at their boots, their attack momentarily thrown into chaos. That was the opening Elias needed. He raised his rifle and fired. The first man went down. The second, his attention diverted, turned toward the sound, and Elias fired again. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the small fire on the floorboards and the roar of the inferno outside. He grabbed Anna, pulling her away from the spreading flames. "Come on," he yelled, dragging her toward the back door. But as he reached for the latch, the door was kicked in from the outside. The last man stood there, silhouetted against the burning barn. It was the man he had wounded earlier, his arm clutched to his side, his face a mask of pain and fury. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Anna. Everything slowed down. The roar of the fire faded to a hum. He saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. He saw the cold, dead look in his eyes. There was no time to shoot. There was only time to act. Elias shoved Anna behind him, shielding her with his own body, and lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the gunman's chest. The force of the impact sent them both stumbling out into the yard. The heat from the burning barn was intense, a physical blow. They wrestled for the gun, a desperate, grunting struggle in the dirt. The man was strong, fueled by rage. Elias felt the pistol's muzzle press against his ribs. He twisted, slamming his elbow into the man's face. The gun went off, the shot deafeningly close, the bullet searing a path through the sleeve of his shirt. He brought his knee up hard into the man's groin. The man grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Elias wrenched the pistol free and scrambled back, putting distance between them. He raised the weapon, his chest heaving, his body screaming with exertion. The hired gun staggered to his feet, pulling a knife from his belt, his eyes wild with desperation. He charged. Elias fired. The man crumpled to the ground and did not move. Silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the hungry roar of the fire consuming his barn, the structure that had taken him a year to build. It was all gone. He stood there, the pistol hanging loosely in his hand, smoke and adrenaline coiling in his lungs. He had won. They had survived. He turned, his eyes searching wildly for Anna. She was standing in the doorway, her face smudged with soot, her dress torn. She was staring at the body on the ground, then at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and relief. He took a step toward her, then another. When he reached her, he did not know what to do. He should check her for injuries, secure the house, put out the fire. But all he could do was stand there, looking at her, the reality of how close he had come to losing her crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. The carefully constructed walls of his self-control, the dam he had built to hold back a decade of grief and fear, finally broke. He reached for her, his hands shaking, and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of smoke and lavender, and held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just been torn apart. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling against his chest. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away the soot and tears on her cheeks. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual stoicism. "When he aimed that gun at you, in that moment, the only thing I could think was that I couldn't. I can't live through that again. I can't lose you." The confession was torn from the deepest part of him, a truth so powerful and terrifying it shook him to his core. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that he needed no one, that love was a weakness that led only to pain. But in the crucible of fire and violence, the truth had been forged anew. His solitude was not strength, it was a prison. And this woman, this brave, intelligent, resilient woman, held the key. "I love you, Anna," he said, the words feeling both foreign and profoundly right on his tongue. "I think I have from the moment you fell into my arms." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, her touch gentle and sure. "And I love you, Elias Thorne," she whispered. "You are not the man you think you are. You are the man I have been searching for my entire life." Without even knowing it, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the refined lady from the East, but his partner, his equal, the other half of his soul. The barn was burning, his home was damaged, and a war with Croft was far from over. But none of it mattered. He lowered his head and kissed her, a desperate, hungry kiss filled with all the fear, relief, and unspoken emotion of the last few days. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a promise, a vow made in the midst of chaos and destruction. It was the end of his solitude and the beginning of everything else. The dawn broke, pale and gray, over a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering skeleton, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the morning sky. The house was scarred with bullet holes and shattered windows. The bodies of Croft's men lay where they had fallen, grim testament to the night's violence. But inside the damaged house, a fragile peace had taken root. Elias had spent the last hours of the night tending to their minor injuries. A burn on his arm, bruises they both could not account for, and stamping out the last of the fire in the main room. Anna had worked beside him, her movements efficient and calm, her presence a silent source of strength. The shared trauma had forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. As the first light touched the horizon, they sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, the exhaustion a heavy weight on their bones. Sheriff Brody arrived shortly after, his horse's approach a welcome sound. He took in the scene with a grim expression, his gaze lingering on the smoldering barn. "Saw the smoke from town," he said, his voice heavy. "I've got 2 deputies with me. We'll take care of this." He gestured to the bodies. "You two all right?" "We're all right," Elias said, his arm resting protectively on the back of Anna's chair. Brody looked from Elias to Anna, at the way they sat together, the unspoken communication that passed between them. He nodded slowly. "This is the end of it for Croft. This is more than intimidation. This is attempted murder. I'm going into town, and I'm arresting him myself. With 5 dead men at your door, his money won't be able to buy him out of this 1 inch." After the sheriff and his men had taken the bodies and departed for town, an eerie quiet descended once more. Elias and Anna stood on the porch, surveying the damage. It was daunting. The barn, his entire winter supply of hay, and much of his equipment were gone. The house would need significant repair. It was a ruin. "I am so sorry, Elias," Anna said softly, her voice filled with guilt. "This is all my fault." "Your home." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "This is not a home," he said, looking at the bullet-scarred logs. "It's just a house, a shell I was hiding in. You are my home." Anna, the words were simple, but they held the weight of a decade of loneliness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring, intricately carved with a floral pattern. "This was my grandmother's. She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He hesitated, the memory of familiar pang. "I kept it because it was a part of life I thought was over. But you're not a replacement for that life. You are a new one, a new beginning." He looked into her moss-green eyes, his heart open and vulnerable for the first time in a decade. "I know this is all I have to offer you right now, a ruined ranch and a fight ahead of us. But I promise I will spend the rest of my days rebuilding it, making it a place worthy of you. Anna Lowell, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked from the simple silver ring to his earnest, hopeful face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Elias." Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her close, holding her as the sun climbed higher, its light glinting off the silver on her hand. It felt like a promise of a new day, not just for them, but for the land itself. News traveled fast in a small town. By the time Elias and Anna rode into Redemption's Peak 2 days later, the story of the attack on the Thorn Ranch was on everyone's lips. Silas Croft was in the sheriff's jail, his arrogance replaced by a sullen fury. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had crumbled overnight. When people saw the courage of one woman and one man who stood against him, the fear was replaced by a simmering anger at his long reign of bullying. But the town's reaction to Elias and Anna was something neither of them expected. As they walked toward the general store, people nodded to them. Mr. Miller came out of his store to shake Elias's hand. Martha, who had been sick with worry, enveloped Anna in a fierce maternal hug. They were no longer the reclusive rancher and the out-of-place stranger. They were heroes. They were part of the community. "Heard you're going to be rebuilding," Mr. Miller said to Elias, his voice gruff with emotion. "A few of us are getting together a work crew. We'll be out at your place on Saturday to help with the barn raising." "This community looks after its own?" Elias was stunned into silence. For 10 years, he had held himself apart, and yet, the moment he had stepped out of his isolation to help someone else, the community had stepped forward to help him. He looked at Anna, her hand tucked in the crook of his arm, the silver ring on her finger a quiet declaration. He had thought strength was in solitude, but he was wrong. Strength was here, in the connections between people, in a shared willingness to build and protect. They were married a week later by a traveling preacher, in a simple ceremony on the porch of the still-damaged house. The entire town, it seemed, was in attendance. They brought food and gifts, tools, seeds, blankets, and 100 small things to help rebuild a home. As Anna stood beside him, her hand in his, wearing a simple, borrowed dress, she had never looked more beautiful. She was no longer a visitor from another world. She was a pioneer, a rancher's wife, a woman who had found her home not in a parcel of land, but in the heart of a man who had forgotten he had won. The resolution was swift, the new beginning absolute. 2 years later, the spring sun was warm on Elias Thorne's back as he stood on the porch of his house, a mug of coffee in his hand. The house was no longer just a house. It was a home. The bullet holes were gone, replaced by solid, well-fitted logs. A new wing had been added, and the porch now wrapped around the side, with a rocking chair that Anna favored in the evenings. The barn, larger and sturdier than the original, stood as a monument to community and resilience. The ranch was thriving, the herd was growing, and the land felt peaceful, content. The wind still whispered across the plains, but it no longer sounded lonely. It carried the scent of lavender from the small garden Anna had planted by the porch steps and the distant, contented lowing of cattle. Elias watched as his wife walked up from the creek, her honey-colored hair braided down her back, her steps sure and confident on the land that was now hers as much as it was his. She was no longer the woman in the fine blue dress who had stepped off the stagecoach. Her hands were capable, her face lightly tanned by the sun, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding peace. She had blossomed in this harsh country, proving that her resilience was as deep-rooted as the oldest pines on the mountain. She was leading a small, dark-haired boy by the hand, a toddler of just over a year old who walked with the determined, unsteady gait of the newly mobile. He had Elias's serious brow and Anna's moss-green eyes. His name was Samuel, a name chosen not to replace a ghost, but to honor a memory and celebrate a new life. Anna looked up at him and smiled, the same smile that had stopped his heart in the kitchen with a smudge of flour on her cheek. "He insisted on seeing the horses," she said, her voice filled with laughter as the little boy babbled and pointed a chubby finger toward the corral. Elias came down the steps and scooped his son into his arms, settling the boy's warm weight against his chest. Sammy immediately grabbed a fistful of his father's shirt, his small face alight with joy. The feeling that flooded Elias's heart was so powerful, so immense, it still sometimes took his breath away. It was a love that was not a phantom limb, but a living, breathing part of him. He looked at Anna, who was now visibly pregnant with their second child, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. He saw his past, his present, and his future all standing before him in the morning sunlight. He had thought his life was over, a long, empty epilogue to a story that had ended in tragedy. But it had only been the preface. The real story had begun the day a train whistle had sounded like a premonition, the day a woman with courage in her eyes had stumbled and fallen into his arms. She had offered him her heart, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the man he could be. It was an offer that had not just saved him from a life of solitude. It had saved his very soul. "What are you thinking about?" Anna asked softly, her hand coming to rest on his arm. He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss filled with the quiet gratitude of their everyday life. He then kissed the top of his son's head. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "that I'm the luckiest man in the whole Wyoming territory," she smiled, her eyes shining. "As am I, Elias. As am I." He wrapped his free arm around her, pulling his family close, and together they stood and watched the morning light spread across their land, a promise of all the peaceful, ordinary, and beautiful days to come.